The Mitsubishi T-2 supersonic jet trainer found its way into the Japanese tech tree in War Thunder. Let's jump into the cockpit. In the late 1960s, Japan recognized the need for a supersonic trainer jet to help pilots transition into the more advanced F-104 Starfighters and F-4 Phantoms that they'd be flying out in operational units. They strongly considered the Seppicat Jaguar, getting as far as contract negotiations, but the talks broke down and Japan decided to go their own way. The Mitsubishi T-2 won the resulting design competition and came out looking quite a bit like the Jaguar, which isn't really surprising considering that they were designed in the same era to fill basically the same role, an advanced trainer with a secondary strike capability. While the Jaguar would go on primarily as a strike fighter, the T-2 remained primarily a trainer, albeit an armed trainer, and it served that role up into the early 2000s. What we have in War Thunder is actually the T-2K, which was the armed version of the T-2. Less than 100 of these were built in real life, and Japan was the only user. In War Thunder, the T-2 is at battle rating 9.7 and carries a pretty basic set of multi-role loadouts. You can take bombs, unguided rockets, and a pair of tip winders. You also get a version of the M61 Vulcan cannon, which is a pretty effective gun, and you get a decent amount of ammo to go with it. In practice, though, the T-2 actually ends up being more useful as a pure fighter than as a fighter-bomber. The plane is a bit underpowered, not as bad as some of the jets, but enough that you'll notice, and you'll notice a lot more if you take a bomb loadout into a match. Flying the T-2 with bombs cripples their performance pretty bad, and it feels worse than it does in a lot of other fighters with bombs. You don't have a ballistics computer, so you're forced into blind bombing anyway. Similarly, flying this as close air support in ground battles can be problematic without any way to reliably aim the weapons. You end up relying a little bit more on luck than you probably want to. The unguided rocket pods it carries are honestly not great, and I didn't have much luck when I tried them a few times. While you're getting started with the T-2, taking a multi-role loadout with some bombs might help grinding out the weapon upgrades, but you'll outgrow those loadouts pretty quickly. For air-to-air weapons, you get the basic AIM-9B and can upgrade it to the AIM-9E. The AIM-9E isn't a very good missile, but it's still a step up from the B model. The secret is to think of the AIM-9E as a B with an uncaged seeker. Don't take any shots that you don't think a B could hit with, and you'll do much better. The radar system on the T-2 is mostly good, but a mixed bag overall. The plane gets a search and track radar with a first-generation pulse Doppler mode. You'll still experience ground clutter, but it's significantly reduced with the pulse Doppler mode. The radar set does good in search mode, but I've found that it has problems locking targets either in regular or pulse Doppler mode, especially at distance. Neither the AIM-9B nor AIM-9E can slave their seeker to your radar though, so your radar set ends up being more useful for search than tracking anyway. I still like to try and get radar locks just for more accurate info on the target's relative speed, but some players won't find it useful at all, even though it's pretty capable on its own. The flight performance of the T-2 takes a little getting used to. It doesn't accelerate as well as a lot of other jets at its BR, mostly due to its below-average engine performance, but it can maneuver okay if you keep the speed up. It seems to turn better at higher speeds, so try to avoid getting sucked into a prolonged rate fight, since your maneuverability will decrease as you slowly bleed off speed. You can drop combat flaps around 700 kilometers an hour if you need that little bit of extra turning, and if you can limit yourself to 1 or 2 turns at a time, you can be a relatively competitive fighter. all of this assumes that you aren't carrying a few thousand kilograms of dead weight around, so if you're planning on air-to-air, then leave the bombs at home. Another thing to mention is that the T-2 doesn't have any countermeasures, so get good at dodging missiles, since this is absolutely a Missile Thunder tiered aircraft. Flying the T-2 out into missions involves a process of sort of evolution of gameplay style. Like with a lot of other jets, I tend to focus more on air-to-ground missions while I'm grinding upgrades. Then, after I get better missiles, I gradually focus on air-to-air combat instead. With the T-2, this held true and worked out pretty well. Early on, I did bombing runs just to try and get like a baseline level of RP per match. Then I switched to the Tipwinder loadout exclusively, after I had the first few upgrades to the plane. Getting into a big furball can often be a serious mistake, since your maneuverability suffers at lower speeds, and you don't have any engine power to reliably disengage, so if you get stuck trying to fight 2 or 3 people at once, it's really just a matter of time. If you can stick to one-on-one engagements, or get the jump on somebody who's tunnel-visioned in on one of your teammates, you'll find the T-2 to be a relatively effective fighter. A learning curve to be sure, but the plane won't hold you back. Landing the T-2 can be tricky at first, but with just a little bit of practice, it isn't bad. The landing speeds sometimes feel a little hot, but the air brake is pretty effective. The T-2 has an arrestor hook that you'll never get to use, and sometimes it bounces a bit if you come in too fast. Thankfully, the gear is relatively sturdy. Remember, this was a trainer jet after all, and you get a drag chute. Visually, the T-2 is just amazing. This is a sleek-looking jet, obviously built for speed, with clean lines and hard angles. You get a few fun skins, including the paint job from the Blue Impulse flight team, which just looks great. The cockpit is detailed, and you actually get a radar B-scope built into the instrument panel. Visibility is good, and I didn't really have any problems when I tried the T-2 a few times with the VR headset. Closing out the Mitsubishi T-2, this plane gets a good set of weapon loadouts which make grinding upgrades a bit easier, and when you're ready to graduate and focus on air-to-air combat, its maneuverability will be decent in a clean configuration. The gun is good, and you get enough ammo for more than just 2 or 3 shots. Also, the pulse Doppler radar is a relatively good tool for low-level missions. However, if you slow down, your maneuverability drops off big time, and even without any bombs holding you back, the T-2 is still a bit underpowered. The lack of a ballistics computer also handicaps you a bit from being a credible top-tier attack jet. The final verdict on the T-2 is that overall it's pretty balanced, and it's a useful addition to the Japanese tech tree. This isn't just a speed bump before the F-1, it's a fun plane in its own right. As always, thanks for watching.